We all agree that our country, Canada, is struggling with a lower standard of living and uncertainty. So today I had the pleasure of talking with my friend, the Honorable Preston Manning, and he's calling for something very significant, a reset not only in our economy, but our Constitution. You will not want to miss this conversation. So, Preston, it's great to have you on as we talk about the state of Canada, and I'm so appreciative that you could join us.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, Preston, I thought I'd cover a number of areas from Parliament to key policy files and where this country's going and getting your wise advice and insight. So I wanted to start off with the whole point is that the federal Parliament is back to work. So you're a former parliamentarian, a leader of the opposition. What's the significance of it that the People's House isn't really meeting very much?
Well, it's a worry, David, because it means that the government's being run by the executive branch, not by the elected legislative branch. And where it's a particular worry is with respect to the control of public finances, because the Prime Minister, even when he was unelected, was making these promises, large amounts of money, 4 billion for the Ukraine, 150 billion for defense upgrades, 5 billion for tariff compensation. All of these commitments were made without authorization by the Parliament or even with a budget.
Yeah.
So it's a worry when the elected representatives of people don't have control of the laws, but particularly when they don't have control of the purse strings.
Exactly. So that's a good point. We have these traditions and institutions to facilitate accountability and transparency. So if they're not meeting, it kind of undermines that whole point. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, no, I think that's true. Now it'll be interesting, and more than interesting, to see when they finally do bring down a budget.
Mm-hmm.
The last financial update, I can't remember exactly what the figure was. It kept creeping upwards, but it was some 69 billion, I think. And then there's been all these commitments made since. So who knows where? And the reason the rank and file citizen should be concerned about these things, that when governments pile up debts and deficits, eventually it's the taxpayers that have to pay, and they have to pay the interest payments on these debt, which are becoming one of the largest single components of the federal budget. So every citizen has a vested interest in basically governments balancing the budgets and doing it through spending cuts rather than by gouging the taxpayer.
Yeah, no, those are very good points. Now, we do know that a release just went out, I believe it was this week, that the budget is going to be tabled on November the 4th. So mark that in our calendars. But there's been a lot of speculation, as you're alluding to, about the magnitude of the federal deficit alone. I've heard estimates of 90 billion. I've heard even upwards of estimates of 130 billion. I mean, this is really up in the clouds type territory. In fact, the interim parliamentary budget officer, named Jason Jacques is his name, because the previous one just ended his term in early September. He said, I'm not aware of what the fiscal anchors are, like the guardrails for the size of this deficit. Like, is it a certain percentage of GDP or the gross domestic product, or there's all kinds of kind of markers you could make here. So does that concern you? Why should Canadians care if our budget gets up in the clouds at say $130 billion?
Well, because ultimately it's the taxpayers that are on the hook for these deficits and debt, and if the government has to repay them, or if the government has to pay the interest on the debt, it's the taxpayers that have to do that. And I think there's a broader concern, David, that if you talk about what's necessary to stimulate the Canadian economy, well, our economy is not functioning well. Our GDP has been going down rather than up. What are the major measures that would stimulate economic development. One of them is for governments to get their fiscal house in order.
Exactly.
Because when that house is not in order and when people are anticipating future tax increases, particularly corporate tax increases, this affects investor confidence. Why should I invest in this sinking ship if that's if that's the appearance that's given? So this is part of a broader, if one wants to get into how to stimulate the Canadian economy, getting the government, particularly the federal government's fiscal house in order, has to be one of the major items on that list.
I think that's a very good point. And what I find interesting is we're having this conversation with you. I mean, one of the things that really made you known well across this country from coast to coast to coast was your leadership so many years ago when, for example, you had governments like Jean Chrétien in office and so many others that where, it's like there's a repeat of history going on here. Big deficits, big debts. And you were one of the voices of sanity saying, this has got to stop. This is not serving Canadians. Are you sensing this as a repeated history?
Yeah, one of the big planks of the Reform Party, and this is going back to the late 1980s, was to balance the federal budget in 3 years. It was they were not balancing the budget, so we ran on that in the run up to the 1993 election, and we didn't form the government. In that case, we didn't even form the official opposition. But we raised this public interest and concern about the deficit and the debt that the Liberals felt obliged to balance the budget. And that, in fact, was done by Chrétien and Martin. There's two stories on that. It's appropriate to tell stories here, David, on how that budget balancing came about. Of course, a lot of the academics and the think tanks say, well, Mr. Chrétien read all the papers that were written on that subject, and he absorbed it all. And my view of Jean Chrétien is that he didn't read more than 3 pages if he didn't have to. So the other story is that after the election, the Liberals had formed the government, and their pollsters came in to see Chrétien. Chrétien paid a lot more attention to the polls than he ever did to policy papers. And Chrétien asked him, how come these idiots, this Reform Party, got 1 million votes in Ontario? The Liberals and the Chrétien didn't care about the West. What worried them was Ontario, and Reform finishing second in dozens and dozens of seats. And of course, the pollster said to him, well, these idiots campaigned on balancing the budget in 3 years. So then Chrétien says, well, what do we got to do to take the wind out of their sails? So they say, well, balance the budget. Chrétien says, let's balance the budget.
Isn't that interesting? So
they
were responding to the public polls.
Knowing Chrétien, I would think he was paying more attention to the polls than he was to the philosophical arguments for budget balancing. But that in those days, the deficit was big, but nowhere near what the figures are today. So there's got to be a major crusade on balancing the budget. And I guess the first step is to see how deep the hole is. And the old saying, first step to getting out of a hole is to stop digging.
Exactly. Well, this really matters to Canadians because we know that inflation comes from government spending too much money. That's where it comes from. It doesn't come from the consumer or the producer. It comes from government. So this has a big impact on people's lives. I mean, I see that all the time. People are struggling with how to frankly meet their day-to-day expenses, right?
Balance the budget.
Okay, so as Parliament has started up, we've heard a lot about getting this economy rolling again, trying to get so-called national projects underway. You've heard a lot about moving the energy sector forward. There's been an awful lot of sense of urgency to be able to move our economy forward because our economy in the last decade has been pretty stagnant. So here's a clip from the Prime Minister kind of outlining these national projects and the conditions, the so-called grand bargain to move these projects forward.
There is a grand bargain which pairs Pathways, a major decarbonization project, with a new pipeline. What's happening here today is we are saying that we are going to accelerate work on pathways. We see this as a potentially viable project. The Major Project Office will continue to do the work. That creates the opportunity for the plus. The plus is potential pipeline to a variety of potential markets. There isn't currently a proponent of a pipeline, a private sector proponent of a pipeline. So there's a variety of potential markets.
We'll pick up on the grand bargain. A necessary condition. So that means that there'll be no oil pipeline that's brought forward to the Major Projects Office unless there's a decarbonization plan like Pathway.
Well, I'd answer the question this way, which is we're governed by a law of Canada. And in that law is to work for projects that advance our independence, our autonomy, have economic benefits for Canadians, advance our climate objectives, partnership with Indigenous peoples. Those elements are there. So projects need to recognize and advance those.
So there you have the Prime Minister really kind of bringing his revelations of how these projects are going to go ahead with the quid pro quo, the trade-off that you've got to have decarbonization. You've got to have this Pathways project, which talks about, you can go ahead with oil production, but you've got to keep to these policies that are still in place. So my question to you, Preston, is how do you read this? Is this still, in many ways, the continuation of the previous Trudeau government, or is it a change fundamentally in direction that gives us hope to move this file forward?
No, I think some of the language has changed, but I don't think the dynamics of it have changed much. They announced these 5 projects, one of which was like Premier Moe and Premier Smith presented the federal government with a list of 15 items in the case of Alberta and 10 items in the case of Premier Moe, that initiatives that the West would like to see done, particularly if the Prime Minister wants to see the discontent in Western Canada ameliorated. Carney's response has only been one item. It was basically to say we're going to encourage the facility, the LNG export facility at Kitimat. And has been pointed out by many people, at the same time, there's still the tanker bans and the production caps, which means that this proposal is a non-starter unless those other things are done.
Exactly.
And now it's that he's going to announce another tranche of projects, and one of those is going to be a pipeline on the condition, according to him, of a major investment in carbon sequestration. His presentation of the bargain is one side of the bargain. Usually bargains, there's 2 sides. And if I was one of the Western premiers particularly, I would say, okay, we see what you want. Here's what we want. Here's our condition for approving this or proceeding on this. And that is federal government withdrawal from every major area of provincial jurisdiction where you have intruded. Oh. And that means natural resources through the Impact Assessment Act and other pieces of legislation, through the Canada Health Act, where the federal government, health is a provincial responsibility. The federal government's involved in that area up to its eyebrows. Property and civil rights. When you get into the civil rights area, our Constitution says property and civil rights is a provincial responsibility. So you start meddling in that area, at least you ought to consult with the provinces. And then municipal government is another area where the federal government intrudes through its mortgage lending bank, where it deals directly with the municipalities instead of going through the province. And if I was one of the premiers, when the Prime Minister says, well, here we've got this one project subject to investment in carbon sequestration or other aspects, I'd say, okay, well, here's our condition. And the main condition, it's not asking the federal government to do anything. It's asking the federal government to get out of the way, particularly on the natural resources sector, because that's the biggest that's the reason why there's no application for pipeline.
Right. Okay, so what you've done, Preston, is you've flipped this on its head. This is like a fundamental call for transformative reform of the federal-provincial relationship and getting Ottawa out of the way, out of provincial jurisdiction, period, full stop.
Yeah, and if there's a grand bargain, my father attended all the federal provincial conferences since Mackenzie King instituted them after the war, up until he went through Saint Laurent, through Diefenbaker, and through Pearson. And he said these sessions at the end of the day, notwithstanding all the PR and the academic writing on them, are horse trading sessions.
Ah, horse trading.
Premier goes in there with a list. Here's 2 things, 3 things I want to get out of it. I got another card here that says maybe here's a couple of things I'm willing to give up in order to get what I want. And everybody there has that. And at the end of the day, if the Prime Minister has any skills, there's some kind of a deal comes out of it. And the grand deal that I see happening if the next federal provincial conference is not the one that Carney's talking about. The grand deal I see is the provincial premiers, and this isn't just Alberta and Saskatchewan. The Trudeau corrupted federal provincial relations with virtually every province by intruding in their areas of jurisdiction. And I would see the premier saying, we want you to get out of these 4 areas. And if I was the federal government, I would come back and say, oh, okay, but you guys have intervened in one of our major areas of jurisdiction, namely trade and commerce, by erecting these interprovincial barriers to trade. And the Constitution is quite clear, trade and commerce is supposed to be a federal responsibility. So the grand bargain I can see is, if Ottawa had any sense, is Ottawa saying, okay, we will get out of those areas where we're invading your jurisdiction. You get out of this one big area where you're invading ours. Now we got a grand bargain that actually might be quite stimulative to the Canadian economy. A lot of investors would take a look at that and say, finally, some common sense coming out of one of these federal conferences.
But that actually makes a lot of sense. You're calling for a major reset of this country, respecting, what is it again? Oh yeah, the Constitution, and how we divide up responsibilities between the province and the federal government.
Respecting our own Constitution. It's basically, there's a reason why there was this division of powers between the federal and provincial governments, and the original Fathers of Confederation were pretty strong on those areas, and that one level of government shouldn't interfere with another. If there had been a threat of that happening in 1867, you would never had the Constitution in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. And the thing about that's kind of, quite positive about that is that it would, you can't run a country if you don't have clear roles and responsibilities, and let those governments focus on their knitting. Let's move. Well, for example, at the federal level, do your job in national defense. I mean, they've been sleeping at the switch for years now.
Yeah, no one's disputing that the federal government doesn't have enormous powers in a whole bunch of areas, as you mentioned, defense, foreign affairs. Nobody's saying that the federal government doesn't have responsibility. When it gets into these provincial areas, you corrupt federal-provincial relations and you create uncertainty, particularly with respect to resource development. And so we shall see if there's a grand bargain, not the bargain that Carney envisions, but a bargain more along those lines.
Exactly. Well, that makes sense. Now, it's interesting you mentioned about uncertainty. I mean, I think that on so many of these policy files, uncertainty has been like right across this nation. And as we know, when it comes to business investment and moving our economy forward, business hates uncertainty. And I'm sharing with you this. I think it's a point that the leader of the opposition is making in the House of Commons regarding this, is that there won't be a proponent for energy as long as these policies are in place.
Now, Liberals would retort that you could still get a pipeline built without removing all of the destructive laws and rules that are in place, because their new powers will allow them to go around those laws and rules. But here is the problem. Even if the Prime Minister were to use the powers in C5 to lay out a path to build a pipe from, say, Hardisty, Alberta, the biggest tank farm in Canada, all the way to the Pacific, either Kitimat or Prince Rupert, no one would build that pipeline today because the government bans the production of the oil going into it, and the shipping of the oil coming out of it. Another illusion. You see what the Prime Minister is setting us up for here. He wants to be able to say, geez, we'd really love to build a pipeline, but there's no proponent. No one wants to build it. Just not a market case for it. Too bad. I guess we can just move on to another money-losing corporate welfare project that will make the Prime Minister's friends fabulously wealthy, making other people poor, because no one wants to build a pipeline. I guess pipelines are just out of fashion. Forget that they're being built far and wide outside of Canada, including by Canadian companies. But in Canada, they're not being built. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that nobody wants to build a pipeline when the government bans you from producing the oil to put into it or shipping what comes out of it. So you ultimately have to get rid of the production cap that is preventing the oil from going in and the shipping ban that is preventing the oil from coming out. Two things that this government has so far refused to do. To put this into context, the production cap that this government has imposed, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, will cause over 54,000 job losses and blow a $20 billion hole in Canada's GDP. It will also make it impossible for us to get our oil to any market other than the United States of America, making us more dependent, ever more dependent on the U.S., exactly what the opposite of what the Prime Minister promised.
So, Preston, I think that clip is pretty powerful because it signals the whole point that in order to get this country moving again, we've got to remove this uncertainty. So I guess my question is, if you were a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada, what would you advise him to do right now to get rid of this uncertainty? Is it really what you just talked about? Is this grand reset?
I sound like a broken record, but I would introduce an act respecting provincial jurisdiction. The Bloc will probably move an amendment, an act respecting provincial sovereignty, but whatever you want to call it. And that act would amend the statutes which authorize federal intervention in areas of provincial responsibility. So it would amend or repeal the Impact Assessment Act, which interferes in areas of natural resources development. It would amend the Canada Health Act or reduce it to 2 pages, just saying the federal government supports quality universal health care for everybody, and the provinces can do whatever they want as long as they respect the universality. It would amend the National Housing Act and the act establishing the Federal Mortgage Bank, because that's the instruments through which the federal government interferes in municipal government, and according to the Constitution, municipal government is an area of provincial responsibility. I'd introduce a bill amending or repealing those statutes, federal statutes, which authorize intrusion in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And I think that would do a lot to improve federal-provincial relations and remove one of the major causes of uncertainty, because the investor looks at the squabbling between the federal and provincial governments, the federal government sticking its nose in everywhere, and it just gives them a reason for, I don't think I want to get mixed up in that.
Exactly. No, I think you're right. So Canadians should care about this. This isn't just about some kind of theoretical discussion about provincial federal relations. This is where the rubber hits the road in moving the economy forward. Is that right?
Well, and particularly Canadians, I think, have got to understand, and this hasn't been maybe emphasized to the degree that it should, that the natural resource sectors are the fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy.
Right on.
Canada, like, what's Canada's internationally competitive advantage? We don't have the biggest population. We don't have the biggest financial sector. We certainly don't have the smartest government. But one of the things we do have is we're the second largest country on the face of the planet, which means you probably have the second largest or maybe the largest stock of what? Natural resources. And so these natural resource sectors, agriculture, energy, mining, forestry, and the fishery are the fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy. And you get the urban voter who may say, well, when you say agriculture, I think of cows and fields of grain or something. That's got nothing to do with me. But if you look at it, yes, there's the agriculture producing sector, but on top of that is an agriculture manufacturing sector, which is quite huge. On top of that is an agricultural service sector. On top of that is an agricultural knowledge sector. And the jobs connected with those subsectors are almost all in the urban areas.
Right on.
So if you're an urban voter, an urban citizen, don't tell me you don't have a vested interest in the resource sectors. You do. You just maybe don't see the connection. So this business, under the Trudeau administration, Trudeau treated the resource sectors as relics from the past, or even environmental liabilities. And I think this country has to recover the importance of those resource sectors and remove the shackles that prevent them from being what they ought to be.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We should be the most prosperous free nation in the world. We've got all these opportunities for development, but it's like we've actively undermined them.
And this doesn't mean, David, that you're going to ignore the social implications or the environmental implications. If you're going to, right now the world's consuming over 1 million barrels of oil a day. Mm-hmm. So cannot Alberta and Canada produce the most socially responsible, environmentally responsible barrel of oil? Certainly one that's more environmentally sensitive than what you're getting from Venezuela and Nigeria. Focusing on natural resources. In fact, you could even argue the environment itself is the biggest single natural resource, the soil, the air, the vegetation. So this emphasis on resource development, if it's done properly, is not contrary to environmental conservation. It can be compatible with it.
No, right on. So let's develop our country and make this the most prosperous nation on the earth. It's all right there before us if we make great policy decisions here. So speaking of interprovincial relations with the federal government, there's been talk by the Prime Minister to change the use of the notwithstanding clause. Help us understand the basics here. What do you mean by the notwithstanding clause, and is this a good idea to get rid of it?
Well, yeah, I guess we got to go back to what it is. The notwithstanding clause is a clause in the Constitution. It's Section 33. It's in the same document as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in fact, the notwithstanding clause was a condition. You wouldn't have the charter if you didn't have the notwithstanding clause, because that was a condition, particularly on the part of Alberta and Saskatchewan, that they would not have agreed to the current constitution if that had not been inserted into it. So it's not something completely foreign to the constitution or contrary to the charter. And what it basically does is say that if the elected people in a legislature or parliament want to pass a law that is at variance with something else in the charter, that they have the opportunity to do that, notwithstanding whatever else is in the rest of the charter, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's basically a guarantee of the strength of the provincial legislatures and the parliament versus the courts, and if it hadn't been there, you wouldn't have had a charter. And I knew you were going to ask me this question here, David, so I actually fished out my notwithstanding file, because it wouldn't hurt, because people wonder what the thing is. And it's in Section 33, and I'll just read the first part of it. It says, Parliament or the legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or the legislature, as the case may be, that the act or provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in Section 2 or Section 7 to 15 of the Charter. See, if you want to pass a bill that you can say that it applies notwithstanding those sections of the Charter. So people might say, well, what's Section 2 and Section 7 to 15 of the Charter? Well, Section 2 is the one that outlines the basic freedoms. Everyone has the following freedoms: freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association. Section 7 is legal rights, about right to liberty and security of the person and so forth. Section 9 is, these are all legal rights. And Section 15 is, or gets into equality rights. And so basically saying a legislature or parliament can pass a law that is not subject to those sections if the legislature or the parliament think that is more in the public interest than what the alternatives are. Now, if Carney starts monkeying with that, you just wonder who is advising the Prime Minister. You take one step to hopefully improve relations with Western Canada by having a few of these projects. If you do this, if you undermine the basis on which 2 or 3 of the provinces actually agreed to the Constitution in the first place, that'll do more to fuel separatism in Quebec and in the West than any single thing you could do. It's a foolish thing to do. And again, you say, well, he could say, well, I've given it to the Supreme Court. Yeah, exactly. What is the Supreme Court?
Exactly.
One that the federal government, 3 of those justices were appointed by who? A third of them were appointed by who? Justin Trudeau, whom the public has categorically rejected. You think they have a lot of confidence in Trudeau's recommendations and appointments to the Supreme Court? So if the Prime Minister wants to improve relations with either Quebec or the West constitutionally, the best thing he could do is leave that notwithstanding clause alone.
Yeah.
Because it's there for a purpose. It was part of the original deal. And incidentally, I could ramble on this, David, but this is not a novel concept. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Bill of Rights and Freedoms, introduced by Diefenbaker way back in the 50s, has a notwithstanding clause in it. The Alberta Bill of Rights, introduced by Lougheed in 1971, has a notwithstanding clause in it. What it's basically doing is asserting the power of the legislature over the courts if the legislature deems that to be in the public interest.
Exactly. The
And
notwithstanding clause is an important escape hatch that allows the legislature, the House of the people, to reign supreme and not the courts.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it an escape hatch. It's an essential component to establish the sovereignty of the legislature
Right
and the
on.
parliament,
Well said.
including over the courts.
Well
So
said.
he I don't know who's advising the Prime Minister, but on one hand say, well, let's do this to reduce discontent in Western Canada, and you do something like this, which would just inflame.
Right. But this is what I
opposition.
find, frankly, somewhat confusing in the sense that we want this country to succeed, and you want to see these green shoots of hope, and then you get these missives where you say, well, it's the same policies that are continuing. The tone is a little bit different. It's positive in that respect, but it's action that counts. It's the policy that undergirds all this stuff. So yeah, there's not going to be any pipelines if the same policies are in place that discount or don't enable any private investor that has any rational head to put their money down and do it. So that's hugely important. And then you have this.
Well, one worrisome thing, David, I don't know if you read Carney's book.
Yes,
It's
I
a
have.
long book. Well, I read it twice, and particularly detailed the second time around. But it's quite clear that Carney believes the public sector and government ought to be the primary instrument for economic and social development. It's the public sector.
Right.
And so you really wonder if throttling this capacity for private sector investment is intended to, so then they'll have to say, well, I guess the only one that can do it would be the public sector. I mean, but that's one of the most worrisome thing about that book of his. He relegates the private sector. The private sector is okay as long as it takes direction through regulation by the from the public sector. And certainly where he's heading now is not encouraging private sector investment in these resource sectors.
Right, which is so ironic. That's the key, is to move forward the private sector investment. Since 1990, we've seen almost $1 trillion net leave this country. Whenever I mention that to friends and colleagues, they all say, what? What are you talking about? Yes, Canada is repelling private sector capital not attracting it like a magnet. It should just, I mean, that's why our standard of living is decreasing, isn't it, Preston?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I think the causes of the decline in our GDP are well known. What's missing is what you're talking about is some resolve to deal with them and to remove the obstacles and the impediments. Yeah.
Indeed. So related to then this whole question then of the economy, we move to the issue of national unity, and I think it's very interrelated, right? As provinces, as communities want to move forward with their economy, but if they're shackled by crazy federal public policy, that undermines that proposition. So is there a kind of a relationship in terms of increased provincial sovereignty between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a province called Quebec?
Well, this gets into the whole subject of there's this profound discontent in Western Canada. It has a number of roots. Part of it is the ignorance and indifference of the Central Canadian media and academia and the voters of Central and Atlantic Canada not having the foggiest notion of what the West is about or why it would be discontent. And then secondly, there's the institutional and constitutional unfairness and imbalances. The Senate was supposed to be a chamber for regional representation, and it doesn't work, and it never has worked, and that bothers the people in the regions. The Supreme Court is not, there's these institutional imbalances. And then there's this mistreatment of the resource sectors, which Western Canada seems to be more conscious of their importance than any other part of the country. So there's all these causes of Western alienation. You can get into some of the reasons for Quebec's discontent too, but leave that aside. So what are the options now that are being talked about? And this is important to your viewers, particularly your viewers outside Western Canada. There's a number of options. The only one that the Central Canadian media are interested in is a secession option, because it's the flashy one, it's the exciting one. But there's a number of options for dealing with these discontents. One is this, what I've called the list option.
The list
where
option?
The list option, where the Premier of Alberta and the Premier of Saskatchewan have given the federal government a list of these are some things. If you did these things, you would reduce the discontent. They include some of the things we've already talked about, get out of the impediments to the resource sector. Scott Moe has some specific ones to deal with the Chinese tariff on canola, which is costing the province hundreds of millions. But there's a list option. If the federal government acted on the list, more than just one thing, but there's 15 of them, that might do something. The second one, it can be called the autonomy or sovereignty option. Basically, this is following the Quebec model, where what the provinces should do, or it's been argued they should do, is beef up the provincial jurisdiction and role in every single area that the Constitution says belongs to the provinces. And also push the envelope in the joint jurisdiction, joint federal provincial areas like environment, like immigration, and so forth. And that option has been pushed more by Quebec, has spent millions of dollars trying to develop that option, and there's attention being paid to it in the West. There is recently a report filed with the Quebec Assembly called the Rousseau-Proulx Report. It has 42 recommendations of more ways to beef up your sovereignty. So that's another approach. Then the third option is the secession options, and there's two varieties of those. One, people that want to secede in order to form an independent country. The second is to secede to form an independent country, but with the intention of some closer association with the United States. So these are the big options, the list option, the autonomy option. Both of those are within the federation. Those are not separatist options. And then there is the secession options, which are being pushed. And in Alberta's case, Alberta has referendum laws where if enough people sign a signature, you can get a question on secession or remaining in Canada onto a ballot. And if the people pushing that option are successful, probably the soonest such a referendum could be held is maybe next spring, given the way the Alberta laws work. So those are the big options. And what's people are watching is whether there's any federal response to any of them. Are they going to respond to that listing other than one or two items? Are they going to respond to half a dozen of them or 10 of them? What are they going to do on this autonomy sovereignty option? They could take the steam out of that by withdrawing from these areas of provincial responsibility. But if they don't, that option is going to become more and more attractive. And if there's no response by Ottawa on any of this stuff, you're going to inflame the secession, the support for the secession option.
Indeed. So this is, in many ways, I like how you're challenging us to think about not only our current situation, but make references back to the historic evolution of this country. And remember, in many ways, the founding vision of this country. It was the British colonies that came together and gave birth to a federal government and said, hey, we can make a British North America here that will do, like, it will be an incredible country. And we can be prosperous together. We can have free trade, but it begins by respecting the sovereignty of those colonies, namely the provinces. That's kind of, in a way, you're calling us back to that original vision, aren't you, Preston?
Oh, yeah. And if you go back to 1867, one of the major forces that compelled the colonies to get together was fear of the United States.
Yes.
Remember, the Americans had a civil war, and they just had a standing army of over 1 million people across the border. Was maybe looking for something else to do. Well, why don't we go? We could go north. So, and it's interesting that today one of the big reasons again for Canada getting its act together is the some of the threatening that is coming from the Trump administration. So, we've got positive reasons and negative reasons to pull together and to pull together effectively. A couple of other things, David, on this particular issue of national unity. There's a couple of misconceptions that I think should be dealt with. The one is that the only option that the West is considering is secession. Like this, if you read the Toronto Star, that you'd get that impression. Well, that's not the case. The two main options are within the federation, but there has to be some response from the federal government. The second one, which is just preposterous, there was a poll taken not long ago that said 62% of Ontario voters think Danielle Smith is a separatist.
Pardon me?
Notwithstanding all the statements that she's made, notwithstanding she's
Wow.
been around in politics for 10 years, she's a libertarian, she's a conservative, she's a federalist, and she's a Democrat, but she's not a separatist. But 62% of the voters in central Canada
Unbelievable.
think that. Where did they get that idea? Where did they get that idea? They got it basically from the Toronto-centric media, constantly focusing on that fact. She's a Democrat, which is why she's saying if there's a bunch of people that want to test the public acceptability of the secession option, Alberta has laws to allow you to get that onto a ballot and let the public decide. She's a Democrat. But to confuse that with being a separatist, and some of these misconceptions, and particularly when they're promoted by the CBC, whom I call the Carney Broadcasting Corporation. When they're promoted in that way, I guess no wonder that large numbers of voters in central Canada, Atlantic Canada, have these total misconceptions about the Western constitutional positions or even the positions of the individual premiers.
Wow. Well, what a great insight. And the irony is that in this time, in 2025, we need a national, incisive discussion more than ever to renew the country. I mean, we should be working together And I'll just give you another angle here, because it's interesting when you mention about the U.S. Tariffs and all the rest, because it seems like there's a game going on. And we saw this with kind of the elbows up references during the campaign, right? Kind of a fear-based narrative that the U.S. was going to march in. To this day, I keep coming across Canadians who think that the U.S. is going to just invade Canada. So regardless, a Leger poll came out identifying top issues that Canadians identify. The top issue is not inflation or affordability or housing or crime or fentanyl, drug overdoses, or a myriad of other issues. The number one issue is perceived threat of U.S. tariffs on this country. So we're putting aside the bread and butter issues that are so essential to this country, and we're dealing in a kind of almost an ethos of fear in some quarters, I would say. So how is that possible?
Well, even take the tariff issue. And of course, the federal Liberals made that the issue in the last federal election. That was used to get Carney elected by saying you're going to be taken over. Carney ended his statement on the leaders' debate by saying Americans want to take your land, which is nonsense. But they use this fear, and this gets into a related subject, that the political consultants that advise politicians today, particularly the unscrupulous ones and some of the ones that work for the federal Liberals, they will say to you, look, the cheapest, quickest way to get public support for a public policy is to scare the hell out of them. Wow. That is the cheapest, quickest way. And that, of course, was the Liberal tactic in the election, fear of Trump. He's going to take over your country, vote for us, and we'll protect you for Trump, despite the fact that Trump was the one that said he preferred Carney to be the prime minister. But on the tariff issue, and that is, if people are concerned about that, let's get into that. For one thing, I think you can argue the Carney government has bungled the tariff issue. In two ways. First of all, their initial response was with counter tariffs. Meet one tariff, the American tariffs with counter tariffs. The stupidity of that is that A, it doesn't work when you're the weaker partner, and secondly, it increases the prices for consumers. It increases them for everybody. Economists have written on this till the cows come home, that there are no winners in tariff wars. It's the consumer that ends up getting hammered. So that initial approach by the Carney administration was foolhardy. The second one was this elbows up thing. Okay, if you want to use the hockey analogy, elbows up is a defensive posture. If you don't have a strong offense, just being defensive with your elbows up, you know what it'll get you? It'll get you a penalty and give the manpower advantage to the other guys. So neither of those strategies is the way to do it. The third weakness in Carney, and this comes from him being a central banker who is used to elite negotiations. Okay, you want to deal with Trump, you go to Washington and you meet with high level people. You go to Wall Street. You elites deal with elites, just like central bankers deal with elites. When you're dealing with the leader of a populist movement, and Western Canada's had more experience with this than any other part of North America, the way you get to a populist leader is not through elite to elite negotiations. You get to him through his own followers, through the people that put him in the office where he's there. Because if he gets too far off the agenda on which he got elected, they will tell him to get back on the agenda. Now, in Trump's case, Trump went all over the United States in 2024, promising, and it's his biggest single promise, promising to get the cost of living down.
Indeed, yes.
Said it dozens and dozens of times from coast to coast. What's the experience of those 74 million Americans that voted for him? Their cost of living's going up. And why is it going up? It's going up as a consequence of tariffs and counter tariffs. It's also going up for another reason. A way back, there was a President McKinley who did the same thing as Trump is doing. He crusaded on tariffs, and it caused price increases. But there was so much talk then of price increases that American businesses who weren't really affected by the tariffs, guess what they did? they increased their prices and blamed them on the federal government. And this is happening. So Trump promised all these people to get their cost of living down. The cost of living is going up. So the way to get to him is through his own followers. This is more a discussion for American voters, not for Canadians, but we look in. And when's the chance to do that? The 2026 congressional elections. 35 senators have to get elected in November of 2026. On the Republican side, many of these senators will be pro-Trump, pro-Trump in terms of law and order, pro-Trump in terms of dealing with immigration, pro-Trump in terms of getting government under, but they've got voters that say, but we can't support this tariff policy. So you should be able to get tariff modifying Republicans elected to that next Senate. And you only need to get a few of them. And you can tip this balance away from the punitive aspects of Trump's tariffs. Now, this is basically for American politics, but this getting to a leader through his own followers is a fundamentally different approach than the Carney approach, which, you got to just go and talk to the top people in Washington and everything will be fine. It's not fine, it's not working, and there needs to be a reset in how Canada deals with the U.S. tariff question.
Okay, so that's, I think, a wise insight, is we need to have wise insight when it comes to the dynamics of American politics and act accordingly in Canada's interest. What also strikes me about that conversation, though, is that surely this is also a time, instead of just kind of simplistically blaming it all on one party. I mean, that's the easy political route here, is to just blame it all on Orange Man bad. But at the same time, we need to get free trade in our own country. We need to get our tax policy in line and to be competitive. We need to get our energy projects going. Like, there's file after file where our choices are to build our own economy quickly, instead of, as we talked earlier about, is smothering it with dysfunctional policy. Isn't that the core problem here?
Get our own economy. The stronger our own economy is, the stronger our bargaining position is with the United States.
Indeed.
But I have a lot of faith. I have a lot of faith in the rank and file people in Canada and the rank and file people in the United States. But these ordinary folks, often called the silent majority because they're not the ones that are in the media every second day, I would argue both of those communities want a restoration of positive economic and social relations between Canada and the United States. I think the vast majority of ordinary people on both sides of the border, that's what they want. And the sooner that desire finds expression in policy on both sides of the border, the better. And it's going to come more through this bottom-up pressure than it is to elite negotiations that Carney is used to do.
Very good point. Well, Preston, we certainly have had a far-reaching conversation today, from domestic issues to even our relationships with the United States and everything in between, and including federal-provincial relations. I guess the question is, what can citizens do here? Like, during this time, I hear a lot of frustration from Canadians and, frankly, concern and a sense of this uncertainty about, well, how bright is our future going to be, not only for ourselves, but for our kids? Like, where they can't even think in many markets of buying a home or kind of creating a family and moving forward. Are you concerned about that, and what can we do?
Well, one thing, I think we can better inform ourselves on these issues, so we can't have the wool pulled over our eyes by campaigns like the last federal election. But a theme I've been thinking of, David, I haven't really elaborated on it fully. Like, I've been involved for years and years in dealing with these issues at the macro level. My father was a premier in Alberta, so we're dealing with the provincial level. I was in the federal parliament, so we're dealing on the sort of the national level. But I've been more and more convinced when people ask me, well, is there any, I can't relate to this macro stuff. I can't relate to, but what you can relate to is the micro. And what I've been saying to, if enough people just address the micro, what does the micro mean? Well, maybe you can't affect the Parliament of Canada, but do you know who your member of Parliament is? And have you ever gone to his or her office and had a heart-to-heart talk with them? That's the micro, not the macro, but that wouldn't be a bad idea. Do you know who your MLA is? And have you ever been to his or her office and had a heart-to-heart discussion and understand so that you can maybe influence them one way or the other? Do you know, and this is where Conservatives have neglected it, do you know who your municipal councillor
Right on.
is? Or who your mayor is? Do you know who's the head of your school board? Have you gone to that school 3 blocks from your house, and do you know who the principal is? And do you know what material have been given to the children there?
Exactly.
Do you know 3 small businesses in your community? Have you ever gone to the owner or the manager of those, asked, explain to me your business and what would make it go better, or what's the impeding it from employing one more person? This is doing something at the micro level, not the macro level. But if you get thousands and thousands of people starting to take care of the micro, it'll add up to the macro. And so I've been saying to people, so there's nothing you can do. I can't affect the provincial policy on this or the federal. Well, you can do the micro. And maybe that's basically what democracy is a lot about, attention to the micro. And that would be my one piece of advice to people who wonder, is there anything we can do?
I think that's great advice, Preston Manning, on both the big picture, the macro picture, and the micro, those small steps, even for every citizen. So thanks so much for joining us, Preston. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.